The deed in Malachi Brooks' hand promised 50 acres of prime grazing land. The price he had paid for it would barely have bought him a horse anywhere else in the territory. But as he stood at the edge of his new property 3 days later, watching vultures circle overhead, the heavy silence pressing in on his ears, he began to understand why every man in town had looked away when he mentioned the Thornfield tract. The land agent's smile had been too wide, his handshake too eager. When Malachi asked why such fertile land had sat empty for so many years, the man's only answer was that the previous owners had moved on to better opportunities. Simple as that. But nothing about this place felt simple. Guiding his horse through the rusted gate that hung crooked on its hinges, Malachi felt unease gnaw at him. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, some rotted to splinters, others gouged by deep marks, too large, too deliberate to be the work of any animal he knew. The grass grew in sparse, broken patches, leaving stretches of bare earth that looked scorched, though no fire had touched them in years. His horse, normally steady as stone through storms and river crossings, shifted nervously under him, ears flicking at every sound. Malachi patted its neck, more to calm himself than the animal. He had spent the last of his savings here, burned every bridge back east for the chance of a new life. Turning back was no longer an option. The main house sat in a shallow valley, its windows dark and hollow. From a distance the structure looked solid enough, good timber, stone foundation, but the longer he stared, the more wrong it seemed. Like a painting with its proportions just slightly off. The front door stood ajar, opening only into shadow. As he rode closer, the details revealed themselves, each more disturbing than the last. Deep scratches clawed up the walls from ground to roof in ragged, parallel lines. The porch steps were split down the middle. Dark stains spread across the boards in patterns that twisted his stomach. Whatever had happened here had been violent and thorough. He dismounted, boots crunching on broken glass scattered across the steps, and pulled his rifle from the saddle holster. The silence was so complete that even the wind seemed to avoid the place. He pushed the door wider and stepped into the gloom. The smell hit him instantly. Metallic, rotted, the sour tang of old blood. Dark stains marked the floor in heavy splashes, silent testimony to desperate struggles. Furniture lay shattered, but covered in dust. The violence was not recent. And yet, someone had tried to clean. The walls bore scrub marks where blood had been wiped, though not erased. The sound of approaching horses snapped him from his grim inspection. Moving to the window, he counted 4 riders making their way along the same track he had taken. Their posture was deliberate, their hands near their weapons, their eyes scanning the land like predators. Malachi recognized the lead rider immediately, Rufus Callahan, owner of most of the surrounding territory. His reputation preceded him like the stench of sulfur. News of the Thornfield sale had reached him quickly, and he had made no secret of his displeasure. The 3 with him were hard men, the kind who ended disputes with violence, not words. Malachi stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled but ready. Callahan raised his hand, halting the group 20 yards away. "Close enough for words, far enough for weapons. You picked a hell of a place to call home," Callahan called, his voice carrying with ease. "Most folks would have turned back by now." "Most folks didn't pay good money for this land," Malachi replied evenly. "I intend to get my investment's worth." Callahan's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Investment? You bought yourself a graveyard, Brooks. Smart thing would be to ride back to town and demand your money back, while you still can." Malachi kept his eyes steady. "What happened here?" The agent claimed the last family just moved on. But this house tells a different story. Silence stretched taut between them. Callahan's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, fingers brushing gun handles. Finally, Callahan spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Some stories are better left buried," he said quietly. "The Henderson family tried to make a go of this place 5 years back. Good people. Worked hard. Minding their own. Then one morning the neighbors found what was left of them scattered across those very floorboards you're standing on. A chill cut through Malachi. What killed them? That's the question, isn't it? Callahan's eyes were cold as Winter Creek. Some say Comanche raiders. Others claim jumpers after their water right. Truth is, nobody knows. And nobody wants to find out. He let the words hang before continuing. What we do know is every family that's tried to settle here ended the same way. The Hendersons were just the latest. Before them, the Morrisons. Before them, the Weatherby brothers. The realization hit Malachi like a blow. This land wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed with blood. He was standing on ground soaked with violence. So what's your interest in warning me? Malachi asked, though he already suspected the answer. Callahan smiled without warmth. I'm offering you a way out. I'll buy this land back today, cash in hand. Same price you paid. You ride away, forget what you saw, and everyone stays healthy. The offer was too generous, too easy. And Callahan's tone was not mercy, it was warning. I appreciate the offer, Malachi said steadily. But I didn't come all this way to run at the first sign of trouble. This land is mine now, legal and proper. The false friendliness drained from Callahan's face. You're making a mistake, Brooks. A costly one. Maybe so, Malachi replied, his grip tightening on the rifle. But it's my mistake to make. The four riders exchanged glances. Callahan gave the barest nod, and his men spread out, forming a semicircle around the property. Subtle, but deliberate. The thing about mistakes, Callahan said slowly, is some of them can't be undone. Pride killed the Hendersons. Pride killed the Morrisons. Pride will kill you too. Malachi noticed something glinting in the dirt near the porch step. Without lowering his rifle, he crouched and brushed away the soil. His fingers closed around a brass button, military issue, the eagle still stamped clear despite years in the earth. You seem to know an awful lot about what happened here, Malachi said, straightening with the button hidden in his palm. Were you there? Something flickered in Callahan's eyes, anger, maybe fear. I was the one who found what was left of them. Trust me, Brooks, you don't want to see what I saw that morning. But his voice carried something else now. Knowledge. More than he was saying. Malachi thought of the brass button. The careful detail in Callahan's description. The way he had appeared so quickly. Funny thing about evidence, Malachi said slowly. Sometimes it tells a different story than the one folks have been told. Callahan's horse shifted beneath him, sensing its rider's sudden tension. What's that supposed to mean? It means maybe those families weren't killed by raiders. Or claim jumpers. Maybe they were killed by someone who wanted their land badly enough to do anything for it. The silence that followed was sharp as a drawn blade. Callahan's men froze, watching for his signal. You're walking dangerous ground, Brooks, Callahan said coldly. Accusations without proof will put. Cora Blaine, as she corrected him, sat stiffly in one of the salvaged chairs by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was young, perhaps no more than 25, but her eyes carried the heavy sorrow of someone who had seen too much. Rufus Callahan came here today, she said without preamble. I saw him riding away with his men. Malachi studied her warily. And how would you know that? Because I've been watching this land ever since word spread that someone had finally bought it, she said. I knew Callahan wouldn't let it lie. He never does. He tried to run you off the way he did the others. The others? Malachi asked, though he knew what she meant. Every family that's ever tried to settle here, Cora said, her voice low. The Hendersons, the Morrisons, the Weatherby brothers. Callahan gave them the same offer he gave you today. Cash to leave, forget they ever tried. Most took it. The ones who didn't. She gestured toward the blood-stained floor. You're saying Callahan killed them? Malachi pressed. I'm saying Callahan wanted this land more than he wanted those families alive. But he didn't do the killing himself. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He hired deserters. Soldiers who abandoned the cavalry post up north. Men who would kill for pay and leave no questions behind. Malachi reached into his pocket and drew out the brass button he had found in the dirt, holding it up where the firelight caught its faint gleam. Would this explain it? Cora's face went pale. Where did you get that? Outside. Buried shallow near the porch. And there are more. Scraps of blue fabric, military casings. Enough to paint the picture. She stared at the button as if it were a ghost come back to haunt her. Then you understand why you have to leave. Tonight. Before Callahan decides you know too much to live. Before Malachi could answer, the sound reached them both, the unmistakable thud of multiple horses moving through the night. Slow. Careful. Trying not to be heard. Malachi's blood ran cold. Get down, he hissed, yanking Cora away from the window. They crouched low as torchlight flickered outside, at least half a dozen riders spreading to encircle the house. Their movements were too exact, too disciplined. These weren't drifters. They were soldiers, trained, coordinated, and ruthless. The house glowed orange as the first torch was hurled through a broken window. It crashed against the overturned furniture, fire leaping greedily across the dry wood. Within seconds, smoke curled through the rafters. They're trying to flush us out, Malachi said grimly, coughing as the air thickened. Cora grabbed his arm. There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor. It leads to a tunnel straight to the barn. The Hendersons built it during Indian troubles years ago. It's the only way. They crawled low through the smoke as the walls crackled and flames licked hungrily at the timber. Cora pulled up a section of loose boards, revealing a narrow, dark shaft. The tunnel was tight, the air thick with dust, but it was their only chance. Boots thundered on the porch above them as they slipped into the underground passage. Shouts echoed overhead, orders barked with military precision. The killers expected to find charred bodies soon. Instead, Malachi and Cora crawled through darkness until they reached the barn. They emerged through a hidden panel behind hay bales, gasping in the cleaner air. But their relief was short-lived. Heavy footsteps echoed across the barn floor. Someone had entered. A soldier, thorough and methodical, checked each stall. His boots crunched closer, stopping directly on the other side of the hay bales where they crouched. Malachi could hear his breathing, steady, practiced, listening. A gloved hand appeared, pushing the hay aside. Malachi raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Cora stood abruptly, her hands raised. "Don't shoot," she said quietly. "I know you." The man who stepped into view wore a cavalry uniform with sergeant's stripes, though the hard lines of his scarred face told of years beyond service. His eyes were sharp, cold, and merciless. "Mrs. Lane," he said with mocking courtesy. "I should have known you'd turn up sooner or later. Always had a talent for being where you didn't belong." "Hello, Marcus," Cora replied, her voice steady despite the pistol aimed at her chest. "Still taking orders from whoever pays better than the army?" The sergeant's smile was thin and humorless. "The army never paid enough for the jobs they demanded. Callahan does. And he understands the value of good work." Malachi rose slowly, rifle lowered but ready. "So you're the one who killed the families?" "I'm the one who solved Callahan's problems," Marcus corrected coldly. "Clean, efficient. No loose ends, usually." His pistol never wavered. "Except Mrs. Lane here. She was supposed to die with the rest of the Hendersons. Been hunting her ever since." "What makes this land worth all that blood?" Malachi demanded. Marcus chuckled. "You really don't know? This isn't about grazing or water. There's silver under this ground. Enough to make Callahan one of the richest men in the territory. But to mine it, he needs clear title. No families. No witnesses." The revelation slammed into Malachi like a hammer blow. The eagerness of the land agent. Callahan's desperate offer. The murders. It all made sense now. He had unknowingly bought land sitting on top of a fortune. Cora's voice was barely a whisper. The families never even knew what they were fighting for. Ignorance is its own mercy, Marcus said coldly. He raised his pistol. But mercy won't save you tonight. Before he could fire, a shout echoed from outside. Sergeant! The house is fully engulfed. No bodies found. They escaped. Marcus cursed and spun toward the door. Stay here, he snarled. Make a sound, and you'll join the Hendersons in hell. He strode away to confer with his men. Malachi's heart pounded. Their window of survival was shrinking fast. Through the barn walls, they could hear Marcus barking orders. The deserters were spreading out, tightening their noose. But Malachi's eyes fell on several barrels of lamp oil stacked near the wall. A desperate, reckless idea formed in his mind. He leaned close to Cora and whispered, I've got a plan. It's dangerous, but it might give us a chance. Malachi moved quietly across the barn, his boots whispering against the packed dirt as he eased the heavy oil barrels into position near the support post. The old timber would burn fast enough to scatter Marcus's deserters and maybe give him and Cora a chance to run. But just as he pulled a match from his pocket, Cora gripped his arm. Wait, she whispered urgently. Listen. Through the still night came a new sound, hoofbeats. Not 6 riders, but many. The rhythm was steady, organized. A troop. Horses moving hard and fast, closing from the ridge. Marcus heard it too. His voice carried sharp across the yard. Positions. Defensive line. A soldier's shout followed. Cavalry patrol. Real army, not deserters. They're coming fast. Marcus's curse tore through the dark. How the hell did they find us here? The answer came seconds later, a familiar voice shouting directions to the incoming patrol. Malachi stiffened. It was the land agent who had sold him the property. There. The barn. That's where they'll be hiding. Cora's eyes widened in understanding. The agent, he's working with them. This was never about you or me, it was a trap. They used you as bait. Gunfire erupted outside as Marcus's men scrambled to hold ground. But the real cavalry had the numbers, the training, and the advantage of surprise. The deserters were being cut down, one after another, the crack of rifles echoing across the valley. Marcus burst back into the barn, his uniform torn, blood streaked across his face, his eyes burning with desperation. You set us up, he snarled, leveling his pistol at Malachi. We didn't know, Malachi shot back, keeping his rifle steady. But I'm glad they're here. Doesn't matter, Marcus hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. You'll be dead before they. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed barn. Marcus staggered, shock flashing across his scarred features as his pistol clattered to the dirt. Smoke drifted from the small derringer in Cora's hands. Her voice was low and steady. That's for my husband's family. Marcus collapsed against a post, clutching his shoulder. The barn doors burst open a heartbeat later. Soldiers in crisp uniforms poured inside, rifles trained on the bleeding deserter. Their commanding officer, a lean lieutenant with a stern, weathered face, strode in behind them. Marcus Webb, he said coldly. You're under arrest for desertion, murder, and conspiracy. Your men are dead or captured. It's over. The lieutenant turned to Malachi and Cora, lowering his voice. Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Blaine, you're safe now. We've been tracking these men for months, waiting for them to expose themselves. Your arrival here forced their hand. For the first time that night, Malachi allowed himself to breathe. The fire at the house raged behind them, acrid stench of burned timber flickering against dawn's first gray light. The ground was littered with bodies. Justice the cavalry had secured the deserters' camp. But he knew this wasn't their wounded hauled into wagons. He had stepped into something larger, along the fence, something that wasn't finished. Marcus Webb sat bound and bleeding, his uniform stripped from him, no trace of authority left in the man who once commanded killers. Lieutenant Harding, stern and deliberate, stood beside Malachi and Cora as he surveyed the destruction. We'll be taking Marcus and what's left of his men back to the fort, he said. They'll stand trial before the judge advocate. The charges are enough to hang them 10 times over. Malachi looked toward the blackened skeleton of his house, the flames now little more than smoke rising from charred beams. "And what about Callahan?" he asked bitterly. "He's the one who set all this in motion." Harding's expression hardened further. "We've had eyes on Rufus Callahan for some time. But the man's slippery. Pays for silence. Buys his way through courts and officials alike. This," he gestured toward the ruined homestead, the captured deserters, "this gives us leverage we didn't have before. Marcus will talk to save his neck. And when he does, Callahan will finally have a noose waiting for him." Cora folded her arms, her voice taut. "You can't underestimate him. Callahan doesn't wait to be caught. He strikes first. He's not going to let this land slip away while he still draws breath." The lieutenant gave her a long look. "That's precisely why you two need to leave. The army will build a case, but until then, you're both target. Callahan's reach goes further than most realize." Malachi's jaw tightened. This land was supposed to be a fresh start. My father's inheritance, my chance to make something of it. Now it's ash and graves. Cora's eyes softened, though her words carried steel. "It was never just land, Malachi. It's what lies beneath it. Callahan knows. That's why families died here. That's why you were marked the moment you signed that deed." The lieutenant gave a slow nod. "Silver. Enough to make Callahan risk open war to hold it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "If you stay, you'll be in the crossfire of something bigger than you can shoulder. Sell the title. Leave this cursed valley behind." Malachi looked down at his calloused hands, then back toward the charred ruins of what little he had built. Everything he had dreamed lay in ashes, but in his chest, something unyielding stirred. "If Callahan wants this ground," Malachi said quietly, "then maybe it's worth more than all of us realize. I'm not running. Not again." Cora studied him, torn between fear and a spark of respect she hadn't expected. Harding exhaled heavily, as if the young rancher's resolve weighed on him. "Then you'd better prepare yourself. Because Rufus Callahan won't stop sending men until he has either the deed or your head." The lieutenant gave the order to march, and the cavalry began their retreat with the prisoners. The valley grew silent again, save for the hiss of settling embers. Malachi stood beside Cora, staring at the land that had nearly cost him his life. It no longer felt like just property. It felt like a battlefield, and a promise he couldn't walk away from. The prairie stretched silent under the noon sun, but Malachi Brooks knew the quiet was only a mask. Callahan's men would come. Whether today, tomorrow, or in the dead of night, it made no difference. The weight of that certainty pressed heavier than the heat itself. Beside him, Cora moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had long lived on the edge of danger. She stacked supplies salvaged from the ruins of the cabin into a battered trunk, her hands steady though her eyes carried shadows. "You should go," she said finally, her voice low. "Callahan won't forgive what happened to Marcus. He'll come for revenge, and he won't stop until the ground's red." Malachi shook his head. "If I leave, he wins. This deed, this land, my father gave me a chance at something more than drifting. If Callahan wants it, that means there's something here worth fighting for." Cora turned to him sharply, her dark hair catching the sunlight. "Worth dying for? Because that's what it will be if you face him unprepared." Before Malachi could answer, the sound reached them, distant hooves, steady and deliberate, carrying across the open plains. Malachi's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Cora froze, her eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Dust lifted on the far ridge. A column of riders emerged, dark silhouettes against the glaring sky. At their center, riding tall on a black stallion, was Rufus Callahan himself. Even at a distance, his presence carried like a shadow over the land. A broad-brimmed hat shaded his weathered face, his coat black as coal, his posture straight and unyielding. Around him rode a dozen hired guns, rifles slung across saddles, eyes scanning like wolves scenting prey. "They're not here to parley," Cora whispered. Malachi stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, the deed folded tight in his fist. His boots sank into the dust as he crossed the yard, stopping at the fence line as the riders closed in. His heart thundered, but he forced his breath steady. Callahan pulled his horse to a halt just beyond the gate, his men fanning out behind him like a noose tightening around the cabin. He studied Malachi for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and edged like a blade. "You've got something of mine, boy." Malachi tightened his grip on the paper. "This deed says otherwise." A flicker of amusement touched Callahan's lips, though his eyes stayed cold. "Paper don't mean a damn thing out here. This land has been mine since before you even knew its name, and anyone who stood in my way has long since been buried in it." Cora stepped forward then, her voice firm though quiet. "You killed them. All of them. Families who never lifted a hand against you." Callahan's gaze slid to her, and for the first time his mask cracked, anger flashing like steel. "Careful, girl. You've lived this long by staying quiet. Don't let his foolishness drag you into the grave." Malachi's voice cut through, steadier than he felt. "If this land wasn't yours to begin with, then no grave you dig here will ever make it so. You'll have to go through me to take it." A silence settled, thick and suffocating. The wind tugged at the dry grass, carrying the tension like a fuse about to spark. Callahan's men shifted in their saddles, hands twitching near triggers. Callahan leaned forward slightly, his voice almost a whisper, yet it carried like thunder. "Then so be it.